Dr. John Brandenburg worked as a plasma physicist and in unified field physics. He worked on the Clementine mission for NASA. He's most well known as the author of Death on Mars, where he examined evidence of a nuclear holocaust that took place on the Red Planet. More recently, he's released a new book called The Cosmic Awakening, which is a primer on the extraterrestrial situation we face on Earth.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, welcome, John, to Exopolitics Today.
Oh, it's a pleasure and honor to be on your show, Michael.
Well, I have heard of your work on Mars, and you have established quite a reputation as someone who has looked at a lot of the scientific data from the different Mars missions to find or gather evidence for this nuclear holocaust there. So why don't we first begin by you sharing your professional background as a plasma physicist and unified field theory, and worked on the Clementine mission.
Thank you, Michael. Basically, I embarked on my career in physics to harness fusion energy, and that requires mastering plasma physics, which is a gas made of charged particles, chiefly hydrogen, electrons and protons, but it's a very fundamental physics, and then lends itself very easily to the whole universe, which is a plasma of hydrogen mostly. And a plasma is like the sun, the stars are all plasma. The aurora borealis or australis down under. It's the neon sign and the lightning bolt are all plasmas.
So you want to tell us about the Clementine mission? How did you get involved in that? What was your work for that particular project?
Well, I was in a supporting role to the mission manager, and who is from Australia, by the way, Trevor Sorensen, just a superb scientist and manager. And he managed the mission. And I was sort of his, he gave me a very high compliment. He said I was his tiger team, that problems that couldn't be solved by other people, he would assign to me and I would solve them for him. And I was just very fortunate to be in that role. And but our major discovery was discovering large amounts of water ice on the moon. And it was a great mission.
So how did you get interested in Mars and the data that NASA was sharing with the general public?
Well, we went through, I was working at national laboratories where at one end they would be working on fusion, on the other end they're designing hydrogen bombs. And you've never gone through an international crisis with a potential for a nuclear war until you've gone through one in a national U.S. government laboratory that does nuclear work. I went from Lawrence Livermore Lab, where I got my PhD at a place called Teller Tech, started by Edward Teller. And then I went to Sandia Labs in Albuquerque. And we went through a severe nuclear crisis that was mostly secret. The public barely knew that we were as close to a nuclear war as during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's called the Able Archer Crisis of 1983. And this it put me in, and many of my fellow scientists there that I worked with, in deep despair as to the future of humanity. And then over the Christmas break, the crisis occurred and then dissipated just before the Christmas holiday season. I found myself at home and saw this show on it was just a little news magazine thing, and it talked about the space on Mars that had been found, and they had two pictures of it, and both pictures showed what appeared to be a face in a helmet, similar to what's found at what's called the Olmec heads in Old Mexico in North America, and products of the Native American civilizations here. And I was so stunned by this that I suddenly had hope for the first time in years that the human race would survive this period of danger of nuclear war, and we would actually have a bright future, bright in the sense of that we would achieve like a world of Star Trek, that we would not have a nuclear war. And because I thought if there's a dead civilization on Mars, this looked obviously like signs of a dead civilization to me. If there was a dead civilization on Mars, then the Russians and the Americans would have to abandon the Cold War and jointly go to Mars to investigate. And I thought, this will end the Cold War. And I had I have a beautiful daughter, and at the time she was only like 4 years old. And I was putting her to bed that night and reading her a story, and I realized for the first time in years I actually had hope for the future after seeing this face on Mars found by two researchers at NASA. So I contacted them. They gave enough information I could track them down, and I became fascinated then with Mars data. I'm a scientist. I once complained to a close friend of mine named Don Ecker, who is a grand figure in the UFO community in the United States. And I told him, I said, Don, the problem with UFO studies is there are no facts. There are only reports, because whatever the truth is highly classified. No one can talk about it openly. So I said, on Mars, however, I have data. I have scientific data. I have NASA pictures. I have all sorts of, data measurements of the Martian atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. It is a true problem a scientist can dig into deeply. And so I found that I was asked to join a group of scientists and engineers we called ourselves the Independent Mars Investigation Team. This was started by Richard Hoagland, truly a brilliant fellow. And he had started this organization, and we used an early form of the internet to jointly investigate. And we found that the pictures were authentic. We were able to verify them. We also found out there was a pyramid, a 5-sided pyramid, 10 kilometers from the face of Mars. And it looked like a pyramid, only it had 5 sides instead of 4. And NASA, we noticed, never showed images where both the face and the pyramid are in the same frame. So the NASA was deliberately concealing the fact that here's another artifact of what's looked like a Stone Age or Bronze Age civilization, a big carved face, and then like a Sphinx, and then a big pyramid like at Giza. And so we were able to verify that then by a scientific exercise. I looked for a similar site on Mars to the original site at Cydonia Mensa, and I was led by, where they had good pictures, and I ordered pictures from there. There were 2 faces wearing helmets. One of the faces wearing a helmet looks very similar to the original face on Mars. It's a place called Galactic Chaos. I love the name. And so our independent Mars investigation team had basically proven that there was a dead civilization on Mars, dating from apparently a time when Mars was Earth-like. I also discovered that Mars had an ocean. I went and presented that at a NASA conference, by the way, in 1986. If you go on Wikipedia under the topic of Mars ocean theory, which is now well accepted, I'm reference number 1, but NASA will never mention my name. I am the Voldemort of Mars, he who cannot be named on Mars. Because even though I discovered the Mars ocean, which everybody believes now at NASA, I also worked on Cydonia and Galactic Chaos, the dead civilization. So they can't talk about me. And,
right. So they're okay talking about an ancient ocean on Mars, but they don't want any Mars researcher or scientist talking about a nuclear holocaust on Mars, because that kind of blows the cover on, well, we don't have no evidence of life on other planets. There's an ancient nuclear war there. So yeah, why don't you tell us about this evidence you gathered for the nuclear holocaust on Mars? Because I remember when your book came out, Life and Death on Mars, that came out in 2011, it created quite a stir. I think there was a lot of even mainstream legacy media interest in your book.
Yes, there was. Here is the situation I faced. I was working in Washington, D.C. with the Pentagon, and as they euphemistically call them in this country, the agencies. And that was my job. That was where my paycheck was coming from. So I kind of had to make sure I wasn't going to offend them. And they basically told me, gee, we like your interesting thing that there was a big nuclear explosion on Mars. We wonder what could have caused such a thing. Perhaps a natural nuclear reactor, which of course occurred on Earth. And so I basically made things a little vague. I said there was evidence of an Earth-like period on Mars with an ocean, probable life. That's why Mars is red, because it had an oxygen-rich atmosphere in the past. If you look at pictures of Earth from space, especially the great outback, it's bright red. It's bright red because of hematite, highly oxidized iron. And Mars is red for the same reason. So the Earth is actually the second red planet in this solar system, but most of it is covered with water or vegetation or clouds all the time, so you don't see its redness. So I put all of that in that book, and I presented a paper on natural nuclear reactors perhaps going unstable on Mars and creating this big explosion. Because when they landed on Mars, or the Mars landers, they measured the Martian atmosphere, and there was a telltale isotope in the Martian atmosphere called Xenon 129. And it was hyperabundant on Mars compared to Earth, the solar wind, Jupiter. Every large reservoir of isotopes in the solar system showed that Xenon 129 and another isotope, Xenon 132, were equal, roughly equal. I mean, they were equal to within a percent of each other. But on Mars, there's 2.5 times more Xenon 129 as there is on to Xenon 132. And what that is a nuclear weapons signature, as it turns out. And that was classified, so I couldn't come out and say that at the time.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's very compelling data. So you're working in Washington D.C. with the agencies. You're connected with the agencies there. You put out your book Life and Death on Mars. Were you approached or were you aware of the CIA's interest in an ancient Mars civilization and then commissioning Joseph McMoneagle to do a remote viewing of Mars at the time of this Holocaust?
There's a very humorous, one of the problems with highly classified things is they do what's called compartmentalization, where the right hand literally knows not what the left is doing, because they say the right hand has no need to know what the left hand is doing. That's the phrase in American English. You have no need to know why we're interested in Mars. And at the time, I did not understand this, but I found out that when we had done our independent Mars investigation of Mars, when I was working in New Mexico during that time period of like 1984, the headquarters for our investigation was at Stanford Research Institute, SRI, in Palo Alto, California. And it was right down the hall from the remote viewing group.
Right.
So not only did the left hand know what the right hand was doing, it refused to tell the right hand what it was doing. And so they, to my our great honor, they looked at the data we had found. They were aware of it before anybody else on Earth was, and investigated using their own methods. And I can tell you that based on my experience in Washington, D.C., I would rather not go into any further detail, that remote viewing is considered a very valuable source of intelligence. It is not completely considered completely reliable. If they find something from remote viewing, they check it out with every other means that they can to see if it's true. I mean, they analyze in the intelligence field, the military intelligence. You listen to rumors. You listen to what people say in bars after they've had a few drinks. That's why they hire a lot of waitresses in the intelligence business. And you take information from whatever you can. You take reports and then you kind of evaluate separately. Is this report reliable? Can we corroborate this report with some other source of information? Can we get a convergence of reports saying the same thing? And remote viewing is considered one of those. The reason you keep hearing about remote viewing is because every government on Earth is now using it. It was pioneered by the Russians. We figured out what they were doing and created our own capabilities during the Cold War. And one person said, nobody's comfortable talking about it, but at the same time, they keep it around because it gives them answers. It's given them answers that nobody else could give them that turned out to be true. So basically, I was told later that the things we had found on Mars were in fact verified by this other method.
Right.
And, yes.
Yes, I know the work of people like Joseph McMoneagle, that military grade remote viewing using the double blind protocol
Yes.
can be very accurate and is used for exactly what you just described. I did want to ask you about this ratio of xenon 129 and xenon 132, that xenon 129 is a marker of a nuclear explosion. I mean, that was detected in Mars' atmosphere, using the different orbiters that were placed around
Yes.
there. Now, did that necessarily reflect an ancient nuclear war on Mars, or could there have been more recent nuclear incidents on Mars?
Well, xenon 129 is stable. It's not radioactive. There are other forms of other isotopes which are radioactive, but their decays are fairly rapid on human time scales. So basically, I guess the best way to say it is it's evidence for a nuclear holocaust sometime in the Martian past. However, we have Mars rocks that are very primordial from the foundation of Mars in the form of Mars meteorites. They don't display the xenon 129 anomaly. Their xenon isotope distribution looks just like Earth's. So whatever happened on Mars in geologic time far more recently than, this did not happen in the early stages of Mars. This happened late in Mars geologic history, but we're talking a time on Mars that was before the dinosaurs on Earth. That's why it's so one of the most remarkable parts of this. There are many remarkable things, but one of the most remarkable things is the faces that are depicted in the carvings on Mars are human. They don't look reptilian. They certainly don't look like the little grays we hear so much about. They look like human beings. And this suggests that humanity is superterrestrial. It predates the appearance of humans on Earth. And this is, of course, fascinating and at the same time baffling. It's as if humanity has been seeded across the stars by some immensely powerful agency that could basically implant the genetic code of human beings in life when it was still emerging on a planet, and we would appear later. So also the other thing, by the way, that this xenon 129 shows is that bad things happen out in the cosmos, just like they happen on Earth. There is no safety net, my friends.
Mm-hmm. Well, this takes me to a related hypothesis put forward by, and I'm sure you're aware of, Dr. Thomas Van Flandern. He came up with the exploded planet hypothesis, and where he suggested that there was a planet where the asteroid belt presently is, and that exploded, and that was a factor in what happened on Mars, and that there may have actually been, that could have been related to the nuclear war on Mars. So yeah, what do you know of Thomas Van Flandern and his exploded planet hypothesis?
I was honored to have many conversations with Tom Van Flandern. He was a brilliant physicist. He's no longer with us, unfortunately. I basically told him, with all due respect, Tom, I find holes in your hypothesis. I will tell you, the idea of the asteroid belt being an exploded planet, the asteroid belt is right next to Mars. It's the next thing out, feature in the solar system outside of Mars. And it looks like it could have easily been a planet or a group of planets that then collided and formed the asteroid belt. by the way, if you want to know where this has appeared in science fiction, there was a Japanese science fiction movie called The Mysterians, where they originally came from a planet called they called it Mysteroid in the solar system, where the asteroid belt is now, and they destroyed themselves with a nuclear war. So this was, and then they came to Earth to try and find a new home. By the way, I'll just mention one other thing. The movie was made in 1957. It shows Japanese women being abducted into flying saucers. It depicts hybridization experiments involving humans and aliens, and underground bases, as well as human traders, people who are so beguiled by the technology of these aliens that they decide to switch allegiances in the struggle between humans and these aliens. By the way, the aliens look like us, except they wear masks because they're all disfigured by radiation. That is the legacy of their nuclear war. Their genetics are all messed up because of the nuclear war, and they're trying to fix them on Earth. This was all in this movie, The Mysterians, which I highly recommend everyone watch. It's made by the same studios that made the Godzilla movies. So we are treated in the movie to a monster robot that looks like a man in a suit. And it's like they had to throw that in there. But the rest of the movie is really quite fascinating. And particularly the abduction and hybridizations depicted. And so anyway, I'm sorry, I've gone on too long.
Okay, well, that takes me to your more recent book that just came out this year, the Cosmic Awakening. So, yeah, tell me, what was it that motivated you to write this book? That really, I thought it's a fine book. It really does a great job in succinctly covering some UFO history and the history of extraterrestrial intervention. So, so what motivated you to write this book?
Well, believe it or not, at the time when I did the Mars research, I did not believe in UFOs. And the reason for that is simple. I had been a graduate student at a government laboratory for 6.5 years. And I was instructed by the people who ran the graduate school, John, there are no UFOs. All of that is nonsense. The Air Force said so in its big report that closed out Project Blue Book. So you're not to talk about that. And if anyone asks you if there are UFOs that are extraterrestrial, you are to say, that's complete nonsense. The Air Force already took care of that question. And my response to that was, yes, sir. Please sign my doctoral thesis so I can get out of here and get a real job and buy my lovely wife a house, as I've promised her all this time. And you are in a very dependent situation. And if the government tells you and you're a graduate student and the government getting your PhD, the government tells you there are no UFOs, you say, yes, sir. You're absolutely right. So I didn't believe in UFOs when I was investigating the Mars thing. And I realized, if there was a dead civilization on Mars, that means we're not alone. And also we realized the government already has seen a lot of these. I have been told there were a lot of pictures from the Viking that the public was never shown, depicting all sorts of archaeological stuff. And so the government knew there was a dead civilization on Mars. They also knew about the Xenon 129. So basically, we not only have a UFO cover-up, we have a Mars cover-up going, and the two are connected. We also have apparently a lunar cover-up. Lunar bases, alien bases on the far side of the moon are included in the movie Mysterians, by the way. But anyway, so I was a late arriver to the whole UFO controversy. I was trying to be a team player as a scientist working for the government. And then suddenly I realized, okay, the UFOs are real and the government is covering that up. So I've gradually been educating myself, and I tried in this book to look at the whole UFO phenomenon as a part of a whole awakening of the human race to our situation in the cosmos, that we're not alone. We're not the most advanced people out here. There is good and bad out in the cosmos, just like there is on Earth. We all aware that there's good and bad on Earth. And well, one thing I say is the rest of the cosmos, the Earth is not an aberration on the cosmos. The Earth and its people are not an aberration on the cosmos. We are part of its fabric. We are a reflection of the cosmos. And that explains why someone would come to Mars, find a primitive humanoid civilization there, and nuke it, just like the planet Alderaan in Star Wars. And you'd think, why would anybody do such a thing? And so this book tries to address the idea that we are going through a transition from our present consciousness, which is very Earth-centered, to becoming a cosmic-centered consciousness. And I'm quite optimistic that we've gotten through the most difficult parts of this now, and that our future will look like Star Trek. We are, I believe, and I truly believe this, we're under the protection of a cosmic federation of enlightened peoples, some of whom apparently are genetically compatible with us, just like the Vulcans in Star Trek. Remember, his mother was human, a terrestrial human, but his father was a Vulcan, which is also human. They just have pointy ears. And so I'm trying to put the UFO situation in the perspective of a larger picture of the evolution of human consciousness. One of the things I found out, by the way, is that the Roswell incident involved the crash of 2 spacecraft, and they were shot down. Most people are not aware of what was stored at Roswell in 1947, which began the modern UFO era. The Roswell incident began, especially for the government, the modern UFO era. And what was stored at Roswell was all of the Earth's nuclear weapons were stored at Roswell. We had 5 nuclear weapons. They were all stored at Roswell. They were Nagasaki-type atomic bombs using plutonium. They had the bombs stored there underground, together with the B-29 bombers, like the same one like the Enola Gay, that carried them in the war against Japan. Remember, when the Roswell incident occurred, World War II had been over for less than 2 years. Everyone's adrenaline level was the same as the war. I don't know what were things. I'm sure things calmed down in Australia, but in the United States, people's nerves were still, and the government reacted to the intrusion of UFOs over Roswell by ordering that they be shot down. And they were shot. 2 of them were shot down, apparently. They got very careless. They were focused on the bombs they were trying to detect the bombs at Roswell. So apparently there were 2 spacecraft flying low in the middle of the night over, and it was apparently the early morning of 4th of July. And they were flying low and slow near Roswell Army Air Base so they could try and detect the plutonium in these bombs. And they were bushwhacked or ambushed by a veteran crew of night fighter, flying a night fighter equipped with radar. It was equipped with radar and 20 millimeter cannons and 50 caliber machine guns. and it apparently surprised them. One of them blew up in midair. That was the pieces that were recovered near Roswell. The other one limped away and crashed about 200 kilometers away, a place called Socorro, where we put up the big, very large array radio telescope. In fact, I think they put it up at that spot where the other craft crashed. It had a big hole in it. It was full of dead aliens. The military showed up immediately to pick it up, according to witnesses. And this happened the same morning as the morning of 4th of July. And then the government went and built the big, very large array so it could claim that this was government property, and no one could investigate the property without government permission.
Aspect of the Roswell incident that I think is worth highlighting. I mean, you point out how this incident really was a hinge of history, or
yes, a hinge of history.
And so the Roswell crash is something that we really need to understand in terms of the repercussions. But
yes.
but you pointed out in your book that the pilots of the Roswell craft, that they were these gray aliens, and that their brains would interface with the technology on the craft, but that there were intense electrical storms that night that disrupted that link and caused them to fly low where they could then be intercepted. So you want to talk about those kind of, the brain interface with the technology and the electrical storms that night?
Yes. That part of New Mexico has very violent thunderstorms, and they're sort of desert sort of thunderstorms, and they're very violent and last for half the night. And this creates an enormous amount of electrical interference. Now, the night fighters involved in this patrol that ambushed this pair of spacecraft were veteran night fighters who were used to fighting in the Pacific in tropical thunderstorms, which were very similar. And so they were used to flying around in lightning, and they were their electronics was all, vacuum tube technology. It was quite immune to any electrical interference from lightning. And so, you could strike one of these, just like a modern airliner can be struck by lightning, and it doesn't bother at all. These night fighters were used to flying in thunderstorms, hunting Japanese night fighters and bombers. And so, but you can imagine somebody who has very sophisticated technology that's very sensitive. It's so sensitive, it's able to pick up emanations from your own brain. I mean, the human brain puts out thought waves. If you had sensitive enough sensors, you could control things with human thought waves just based on our present technology. You probably have to wear a helmet, special helmet now, but you could imagine that people later it'll be just like Wi-Fi, and you won't need any. You could have a chip implant. I discourage people from doing that. But if you are carrying a chip implant, you're communicating by this Wi-Fi kind of with your spacecraft. And then there's all this lightning going on. And not only that, you're trying to pick up characteristic gamma rays from plutonium. And if you have atomic bombs, they're putting out a lot of gamma rays from this plutonium, but if they're underground, they're partly shielded. So you have very weak signal. So you have to fly low to the ground, as low as possible, and slowly to try and pick up good signal from this plutonium. So if you're focused on that in the middle of a lightning storm, you don't notice that this night fighter is sneaking up on you. And the veteran crews of U.S. Night fighters were experts at sneaking up on airplanes in the middle of the night one thing people would do, both the Germans and the Japanese, was they developed radar detectors so they could pick up the radar from planes like that. But the Americans learned that if you got within 5 miles of the plane you were tracking, to turn off the radar. So then they have nothing. And what you used then was very high-powered night binoculars. And they would train their vision. So, and they had crews who had just extremely acute vision. And they would use these night binoculars, and they would come in visually on the craft in the middle of the night, especially if it's being lit up periodically by lightning. And this was not a problem. The last plane shot down in World War II officially was a Japanese bomber shot down at night by a American night fighter, which was called the P-61 Black Widow. It's not as poisonous as the funnel web spider in Australia, but it has quite a bite, and it'll put you in the hospital if you get bit by a black widow. It's got very good venom, and it's a glossy black spider with a characteristic hourglass on red hourglass. It's glossy black with a red hourglass on its belly, so you can tell it and stay away from it. And I've seen a lot of them growing up. And the night fighters that were used, the P-61 Black Widow, was just a propeller-driven plane. They didn't even have jet fighters that were night fighter capable, because it could carry its own radar and everything. This is 2 years after World War II. And they found the best paint coat for the night fighters for night was glossy black. They tried flat black. That didn't work as well. But especially if somebody's looking for you with a searchlight, if the Germans or the Japanese are looking for you at night with a searchlight, it's better to have a glossy black. In fact, that's probably why the Black Widow has its same glossy black surface. And so we're talking people who are highly skilled from World War II combat veterans, flying a very well-equipped and very capable airplane, even though it's propeller-driven. They're chasing something that is flying low and slow, whose pilots are confused and disrupted in their minds by the lightning, and they were just in a very vulnerable state, and they were ambushed.
It does make sense, actually, that explanation for how those crafts were shot down during that lightning storm. There was another incident in April 1941, that is the Cape Girardeau UFO crash you talked about. That
yes.
Reverend Huffman, and Harry Truman was the senator at the time for Missouri, and also a high-ranking Mason, and he played a role in covering up the incident. So I just wanted to kind of like find out, what was Harry Truman's role in covering up the Cape Girardeau UFO crash, and could that have played a role in him actually replacing Henry Wallace as vice president to President Roosevelt in 1944?
What we are finding out is that the UFO cover-up predates even Roswell. It apparently started in earnest after the Cape Girardeau incident, which was a crash of a saucer-shaped alien spacecraft, and the people on board were the Greys. Most of them were dead except for one, and the FBI had shown up. The FBI was then an operational thing, and Army intelligence had shown up. And it may sound like a very sentimental thing to do, but they went and found a pastor to say last rites over this dying alien. They wanted, it was one of the motivations would be, we want to show if somebody from outer space is coming here, we want to show that we treat the bodies of their people with respect. And it was like, but I'm sure this was all being made up on the spot. But the people the Masons, as we know, are a secretive organization that has a lot of adherents, and one of the chief adherents in the Cape in Missouri was Harry Truman. And what we're finding out now, friends, is that the U.S. government has one of the hidden agendas of this U.S. government from even before World War II started. 1941, Pearl Harbor hadn't happened yet. That this UFO cover-up thing has been running that long and has been influencing very basic decisions by the U.S. government. Apparently, the government knew immediately then that we faced a war of the worlds. War of the Worlds came out in 1900, by the way, that we faced a war of the worlds kind of potential situation. People's nerves were already on edge because World War II had already begun in Europe with the invasion of Poland by Hitler. And so it was a terribly turbulent time. And so then this incident happened where this thing crashed in Cape Girardeau which is a feature on the Mississippi River in the middle of the United States. So then Harry Truman knows all about it. And apparently that's one reason he was tapped to be the vice president, one heartbeat away from the presidency. Truman and Roosevelt did not get along particularly, but they apparently picked Truman for two reasons. One, he was a combat veteran of World War I. He was used to shells going off around him. And also he knew all about Cape Girardeau and the fact that we were not alone in the universe. So he ended up being president. Oh, the next thing that happened, by the way, was the Battle of Los Angeles that occurred right after Pearl Harbor, which is another interesting story I explore in my in my book. By the way, if you think we all agree that not only does intelligence exist elsewhere in the universe, but the Battle of Los Angeles shows that not only does intelligence exist elsewhere in the universe, but showed us complete incompetence and stupidity. Because of a very bad confluence of events, this was right after Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor had happened only less than a month before this thing happened in Los Angeles. And they had radars put up. We'd gotten radars from the British, and we were putting up radars around, especially the West Coast cities. So we had radar coverage of Los Angeles. And as happened several times, by the way, a Japanese submarine surfaced off of Los Angeles. The crew in the middle of the night, and the crew got out, unlimbered their deck gun, and lobbed a few shells into a oil refinery at Long Beach, setting a large storage tank full of diesel oil on fire. So this, nobody's, you can't pick up radar. Radar in those days could not pick up submarines surfacing off the shore. So this caused everyone to go into a complete panic and chaos. And then the submarine basically just said, okay, we've proved our point. And the crew got back on their submarine under the decks, and then this thing submerged and sailed away. Okay, that was, like February 21st, the night of February 21st. On the night of February 22nd, the next night, the radar picks up 4 targets coming in from the Pacific Ocean. And everyone assumed they were Japanese fighters, which the Japanese knew. The Japanese could actually launch seaplanes from submarines. And everybody thought the Japanese are coming back to try and drop some bombs on Los Angeles with these seaplanes. So they went to maximum alert, watching these blips come in on the radar. And they had large numbers of 75 millimeter guns, anti-aircraft guns, very high velocity gun, like a German 88, basically, and only 75 millimeters. And then they had all these searchlights, and they had all these 50 caliber machine guns, which can fire shells very high up. And they waited for these objects to come in over LA, and they spotted them visually and started shooting at them. And apparently they were alien spacecraft who had not been watching the news. They should have known it was a bad time to go fly over Los Angeles. And instead they came and flew over Los Angeles. And they, like you could see one of those pictures, that's an authentic picture from the LA Times. They had one of the objects trapped in the searchlight, and those are flak bursts going off around it. By the time it was basically just paralyzed, sitting there in the searchlights with all this stuff and going off around it. And the reports that I heard was of the 4 spacecraft that came in off the ocean that night. 2 of them were shot down. One crashed north of LA in the forest, or what passes for forest around LA. The other one crashed on Catalina Island. That was picked up by the Navy. The Army picked up the one north of LA. And oh, by the way, you'll love the explanation from the government. This was all just caused by weather balloons. The weather balloon The weather balloon story began basically with the Battle of Los Angeles. And every time the government's people see or find something that the government doesn't want to talk about, they say it was a weather balloon. So apparently, like I said, not only is intelligence found elsewhere in the universe, but just like on Earth, so is extreme stupidity. And
now, you proposed a really interesting theory I hadn't heard before, and that is that that the greys that were shot down over Los Angeles, and even
Yes.
even the incident at Cape Girardeau, that these greys they came from Zeta Reticulum, and that they got that the first radio signals were generated from Earth in 1900 with Marconi, and it took 39 years to reach Zeta Reticulum, which
yes,
clearly 39 light years away, and that they then immediately came and they showed up, and the Earth is in a global war. So
you didn't catch Earth at a good moment. Sorry.
Yeah. So you want to kind of like explain that, because I hadn't heard that explanation before, but it's a fascinating one.
Yes. 2 things happened around 1900, or just in the year or 2 preceding it, was intelligent radio signals started being generated by human beings. Marconi, they started sending Morse code. And of course, if you send things to ships at sea and radio other points on land, part of those signals goes off into outer space. And so they travel at the speed of light. And so Zeta Reticuli, which has been discussed as the source star for the grays, is about 39 light years away. So you could imagine that you've got increasing radio noise, and the people at Zeta Reticuli who have warp drive notice that they're picking up all this signals, and they decide to come here rather than just sending little probes. They come here in some substantial numbers. And so they arrive around 1940, 1942 time frame. And then, of course, they find that the human race is embarked on the most destructive war in history. And they didn't find us at a very good, they caught us at a bad moment. But actually, given what we know now, this may have been a good thing because the Greys were deterred. There was another thing that happened in 1900. That was the publication of the book War of the Worlds. In War of the Worlds, you had an invasion from outer space by people with directed energy weapons, poison gas. They were mass murdering aliens who used human beings as a food source. They would use the blood of humans as their main nutrient. This is all in the book by H.G. Wells, which I read. It also featured like London being leveled completely, almost as if it was the city of Dresden, as a result of the Martian or these aliens arriving. The first place where you find the word alien used in a very prominent public document, by the way, also followed the publication of War of the Worlds. That's in the American Standard Bible, where it says, "Thank you, Lord, for teaching me how to fight against the aliens." It says that. Psalm 144. Psalm 144 talks about the aliens whose right hand is falsehood. And thank you, Lord, for teaching me to war with the aliens. That was published right after War of the Worlds was published. And it was the first document I can find where the term alien was used instead of foreigner or something like that, stranger, was used in widely read literature. But also the depictions of mass destruction of cities, of massacre of populations, of using humans as a food source, directed energy weapons, poison gas, all occurred in fiction before it occurred in World War I and World War II, especially World War II later. And so then the radio waves from Marconi, the contemporary event, arrived in Zeta Reticuli, and this is where triggered the Greys coming here in substantial numbers. There's evidence the Greys had come passing through, but didn't find anything of interest.
Now, there's another group of extraterrestrials, the human-looking ones. Now, you talk about the Pleiadians, but I'm also interested in these Aldebaran extraterrestrials that Maria Orsic apparently made contact with in the 1920s.
The Aldebaran, yes.
Yes. So what do you know about them establishing communication with Orsic and the Germans, and them arriving or being involved with the German development of the flying saucers?
There's this very interesting question, very interesting line of inquiry. Maria Orsic was sort of a channeler, but she was a channeler for Adolf Hitler, and she was one of the chief people in what was called the Thule Society, which then became the Nazi Party, or heavily influenced it. And she claimed to be in contact with aliens from Aldebaran. I don't know much beyond that. Some people have said that the people from Aldebaran are reptilian. Other people say, no, they're blonde, blue-eyed people, as sometimes reported, predominating in these Pleiadian reports. They call them Nordics. The Pleiadians, is my understanding, would have hated Hitler. They obviously didn't help him in World War II. One of the reasons also this is important, it may explain why Hitler refused to consider surrender or negotiating a peace term even after losing the Battle of Stalingrad. He was at war with the United States, the British Empire, and the then Soviet Union, and he couldn't win. And any logical person would have thought, well, it's time to negotiate a peace, an armistice.
Right.
But instead, he continued to the bitter end. It was almost as if he believed that aliens were going to intervene on his behalf to save him and the Third Reich. Obviously, they did not. And yes.
So you basically identified the Greys being involved in some very nefarious activities, such as
Yes.
human mutilations, and you give a couple
Yes.
of cases. One involving Sergeant Jonathan Lovett in 1956, and also
Yes.
one in Russia at a Dyatlov Pass incident, I guess, in the Ural Mountains. So, yeah, you want to describe what happened in those cases and why those two cases were watershed moments in terms of how the US and the USSR would deal with these grey extraterrestrials.
Right. The Sergeant Lovett case was an example of somebody disappearing while out doing his duty at White Sands. He was there with a Army major. They had separated, and when the major heard him screaming for help, ran over a sand dune. They were looking for missile debris to bring back to the lab to analyze. And he found him being dragged into a flying saucer by a metal tentacle, like an octopus tentacle, but it was mechanical. And they found Lovett then several days later, 10 kilometers away, and his body had been horribly mutilated in a manner which you did not see until you saw the animal mutilations that are so common in the American Southwest to this day. Same pattern of mutilation. Eyeballs gouged out, tongue cut out, genitals cut off. I don't want to even go into all the details. Horribly mutilated in a manner very similar to what later was the pattern of mutilation of the cattle. The Ditlev Pass incident involved human mutilation of a party of Russian hikers, and also followed a similar pattern as we see now in livestock mutilations. So the gray aliens apparently are trying to terrorize the human race. This is, I'm sorry, human beings do these sorts of things. We don't like to talk about them, but they do it. And it's a weapon of terror in war. And now the Russians, interestingly enough, apparently shot down, they had their own Roswell incident. And once again, it was one of their top secret military bases. And they had an early MiG-15 fighters flying patrol over that. And one of them shot down an alien craft. And the pilot of the MiG was, unfortunately, the MiG went down also. The pilot was killed. And so the Russians then became aware of the Greys also. But you got to remember one thing. Following World War II, America felt pretty safe, but the Russians did not. And they imagined that any unidentified flying object over the Soviet Union was probably a British or American spy plane. So they would scramble whatever jet fighters they had and their anti-aircraft to shoot it down. And they in this case, this incident, they didn't even know what this thing was. But they just knew it was flying close to one of their nuclear research bases. Kiptitsin Yar, I believe, is the name of it. And you can imagine this bunch of Russian troops rolling up in the Russian equivalent of a deuce and a half truck, and getting out with their furry hats and prying open the hatch on this thing and looking inside, and they say, "Niet Amerikanski." They're not American. So the Russians that made this discovery, this was not an American craft. This was somebody else, and but they decided that they didn't care who they were. They were going to shoot them down because that's just very Russian. I mean, Joseph Stalin was in charge of Russia in those days. This was mentioned to Joseph Stalin, and he said he had no patience. He had no patience with anybody even from another planet snooping around in Russia.
Now, one of the things that I also found fascinating in your book was that you described this kind of debate that was happening in the U.S. military intelligence community. On the one hand, there were those that were aware of the Greys doing these mutilations and doing other things.
Yes.
And then on the other hand, they were aware of these human-looking extraterrestrials, Pleiadians or Nordics, that were kind of like our genetic ancestors and had infiltrated, were walking among us. And you described how the 1951 movies, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and The Thing represented the kind of the polar opposites in this debate. So you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, it was it's fascinating. The same year, 1951, the first movie released was The Day the Earth Stood Still, where you had a basically human alien coming down to try and urge us to calm down and not blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons, and also told us that we had to be on our best behavior if we wanted to join the fellowship of enlightened alien civilizations. So it was quite humanitarian. His motions, his appearance, and his dialogue with human beings was very humanitarian. Of course, he had this robot enforcer with him, but that just illustrated how technologically backward we were compared to the people we were dealing with. And this may have been inspired by other knowledges that the U.S. government had. But then, of course, the next movie coming out a few months later was The Thing from Outer Space, featuring James Arness, who later played Marshall Dillon in Gunsmoke, as a, by the way, it is the first movie to depict human and animal mutilations. It's also the first movie to show that the creatures from outer space liked human blood. And this is another feature of the mutilations. The bodies are of livestock, and of human mutilations, the bodies are drained of blood. Now, anybody who knows anything about vampire bats or mosquitoes for that matter, knows that blood is a very good source of nutrients for various life forms. So it's a very natural biological choice. But they put that in the movie, The Thing, and they basically, and they find a flying saucer buried under the ice. One of the other hidden messages is that the flying saucer can be destroyed. They try and get it out of the ice with thermite charges, and it ignites it. It's like it's made out of magnesium, basically. And that was another little the whole thing was, of course, they kill the alien after the alien kills several people, and in very grotesque ways. But they end up killing the alien, and they also destroy his spaceship. And what that is a subtext is that yes, these people who have arrived from outer space, no, they aren't very nice, but they're not bulletproof by any stretch of the imagination. And
later incident, and you described that as well. That is the Dulce firefight in 1979
yes,
that took place at that underground facility there in Dulce, where there was these grey aliens working with the military, and there were also reptilian aliens there too, according to various sources.
yes.
And there was a firefight there, and it occurred during President Jimmy Carter's administration. So you want to tell us, what happened when he heard about that?
Well, the accounts I heard were from several sources in Washington, D.C., who were well connected with the intelligence community. And so I decided, if you kind of took all the the reports differed in details. And one fellow, Leonard Stringfield, who had heard these reports, also said that, it was basically typical of any combat situation. Everything's very confused, and people standing next to each other, getting shot at, report slightly different versions of what happened. But it apparently, let me give you a little backstory. Apparently, the government decided to try and negotiate. We were losing the war in Vietnam, and the government decided to try and seek détente, not only with the Russians, but also with the Greys. So they apparently had a meeting sometime within the late administration of Johnson or early administration of Nixon at New Mexico, near White Sands, New Mexico, at an Air Force base there called Holloman. And apparently they began negotiations with the Greys and established a secret treaty, which is illegal under the U.S. Constitution, by the way. But the secret treaty was basically, one way you can describe it is desperate times require desperate measures. We were losing the Cold War temporarily against the Russians. We wanted some breathing space. And we had a Cold War in space. We had a Cold War on the Earth. We wanted some breathing space, so we tried to put together something. And the Greys said, we want to abduct some people and take genetic measurements of the human race. So the government said, yeah, okay, just give us a list of the people you're going to abduct so we can monitor it, and you're not going to harm them, right? And the Greys said, oh, of course not. And this was done in the early Nixon administration, apparently. And what may have happened, what apparently happened was this was leaked. Remember, one of the things that happened then publicly was Project Blue Book went out of business. The government issued a scientific report saying there wasn't anything to the UFO controversy. And so everyone should quit talking about UFOs. The government had made a peace treaty with the UFO aliens, the Greys. Now, this was celebrated apparently by Hollywood. In America, Hollywood and Washington, D.C. talk to each other, especially the intel agencies. Hollywood is, since World War II, Hollywood has always been a propaganda arm of the U.S. government. So apparently this news of this was leaked to Hollywood and inspired Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where if you watch that movie, it's just this wonderful love fest celebration of making contact with the gray aliens. and having a nice meeting with them. Now, that was in 1975. 3 years later, apparently the government was sharing a base with these aliens. We were in the upper levels, they were in the lower levels. We discovered that they had a large number of human captives in the lower levels, and they sent in special forces to try and rescue them. And this resulted in a ferocious battle underground. The Leonard Stringfield, who unfortunately is no longer with us, told me, he says he'd heard 3 different accounts from his sources in the military, and he said the only difference between the accounts basically was the body count. How many aliens got killed, how many humans got killed. Something like 80 people, 80 human beings got killed, a large number of aliens also. And Jimmy Carter was then our president. This happened in 1978. And the reaction to that, by the way, by Hollywood was the movie Alien. So if you want to entertain yourself over the holidays, watch back-to-back Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and then watch the movie Alien and see what a difference a few years make in terms of the intel community's attitude towards the aliens. There.
Dulce firefight in 1979 was a really critical event because it showed that whatever agreements had been reached with these grey extraterrestrials from Zeta Reticulum, that these greys couldn't be trusted, and that they were doing terrible things to human captives. And so then you described a process. It's quite an elaborate process, but there was a process by which, at the end of the day, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev decided to cooperate to deal with the grey extraterrestrials. So, walk us through that.
Well, the first president to find out about this was apparently Jimmy Carter. He had gotten elected president, and everybody loved him because he was an outsider of Washington, D.C. But everyone loved him in the country because he wasn't part of what they call the swamp in Washington, D.C. So he arrives in Washington, D.C., and the first thing he'd seen a UFO. They had 10 other witnesses for the same incident who saw it with him, and he inquires in the government about if they know anything about UFOs, and the Pentagon and NASA and the intel agencies said, "Oh, we don't know anything about UFOs. They're unidentified, right?" So they told him nothing. He was out of the loop, and he was a shrewd enough fellow to know that he was being lied to. So here he is, the captain of a cruise liner like the Titanic, and he realized there's stuff going on board this ship. I have no idea what is going on in the lower holds, and no one will tell me, even though I'm supposed to be captain of this ship. So he's sitting in his office one day in 1978. No one will tell him anything. Suddenly, a bunch of generals and other military people march into his office along with officials from the intel agencies, say, "Mr. President, we have a situation we have to tell you about." This is apparently 1978, spring of 1978, right after Dulce had happened. And they said, and he says, "What's going on?" And they say, "Oh, the UFO aliens that we didn't tell you about, we have a secret treaty with, sharing a base. Well, we got in a big firefight with them. And this is a big problem. What do we do? Do you have any orders, sir?" And they said he was just emotionally devastated by this, not only from what they had told him, but because it revealed that even though he was president, he was being lied to by everybody around him. And so but his religious faith, apparently, he was very, very strongly religious. And this steadied him, and he basically ordered that they shoot on sight against gray craft. But by that time, we had a bunch of other aliens who'd shown up. at least 50 different types. And he basically said, shoot at the gray craft, but leave the other ones alone because they're friendly. So it was a very complicated situation. But then, of course, the Cold War had been going on for 40 years. By that point, Ronald Reagan became president. He wanted to do a Star Wars space defense program. He even told the Russians, we'll include you too. And suddenly, the Cold War just goes away. There was one, I must share this, there was one picture that summarized the baffling aspects of this. It was the Soviet Minister of Defense, a World War II veteran named Akramerov, a nobleman. He's sitting on the deck of a U.S. aircraft carrier with an American admiral who was head of the Joint Chiefs, apparently. They're watching a flyover of American carrier jet fighters and fighter bombers. And Akramerov is grinning ear to ear, looking at this. He looks like he's the happiest man alive. So what it is the United States and the Soviet Union became allies against the Greys. And that's why the Cold War ended. It didn't end because of Afghanistan. It didn't end because the Russians were having a hard time financially. All of that was true. But the Russians are Russians. They're used to hardship. No, it ended because we had to form an alliance against the Greys, and that meant we had to share technologies. And I heard the report in Washington, D.C., as the Cold War was ending, that parties of Russian military officers were being brought to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where they stored a lot of the UFO stuff, and being shown everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where I think your book really addresses an issue that is of great interest to us today, and that is the growth in the number of grey human hybrids, that these were genetically engineered by the Greys, going back to those early agreements, and that they have created so many of these hybrids that they are now a threat to humanity's future. And that you support the work of Dr. David Jacobs, whose book, The Threat, kind of outlined this, this proliferation in abductions, millions of abductions in the United States and elsewhere. And so there must be similarly millions of hybrids that were going to be used at some point to do what exactly to humanity?
Well, basically, because of if you read the novel War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, who was just a brilliant man, the alien invasion in the War of the Worlds failed because they didn't have immunity to common Earth bacteria. They were dying of athlete's foot and the common cold on board their Martian tripods. So what you do to avoid that is you achieve genetic fusion with the inhabitants of a planet and create hybrids. So in this case, they were trying to transfer the human immune system, which is evolved over millions of years, to be immune to all these very common bacteria on Earth. You transplant that genetic trait into hybrids, so then you can colonize the Earth at humanity's expense. I mean, and knowing human beings, you can't peacefully coexist. If you're trying to colonize this planet, you can't peacefully coexist with the rest of the human race. You have to get rid of them as quickly as possible. So this was I published this independent of David Jacobs. I published my hypothesis back in 1992. He independently arrived at it by talking to the abductees. And so, but here's the thing. This is a marvelous thing. The human race is a bunch of lucky sons of guns, as they say here in the United States. Lucky sons of guns, because it turns out the Greys apparently have copper-based blood, not iron-based blood. Their blood is blue. In fact, it may be where we get the term blue bloods as being, godlike. The octopus has blue blood. So do scorpions. Invertebrates on this planet, and the octopus is very smart, by the way. So smart, at least as smart as a house cat. That uses copper, and the copper turns bright blue when it's exposed to oxygen instead of bright red, which is iron. Now, as it turns out, copper-based blood doesn't carry oxygen as well as iron-based blood. It's not optimal for a planet like us with warm temperatures and lots of oxygen. So they're trying to make hybrids, but reportedly the hybrids are very sickly, have a very high mortality rate, and are basically wimps. They're trying to mix two different types of blood pigments, and it just didn't work very well. Here's another thing. There are human beings, and I was told this in Washington, D.C., there are human beings walking around who are actually not terrestrials. They act, behave, look, and have the same genetic material. They can intermarry with us and have children just like in Star Trek, but they're not from here. I heard that this was a cause for concern. It was the hybrids with the grays. That's not been successful. Basically, the genetic they are not robust hybrids at all. But the people who come down from the Pleiades apparently intermarry with us just fine. Because of antiquity, where there were frequent, it's even in the Bible, there were frequent descriptions of people from outer space, people from the heavens coming down and having children on Earth with human women. We're all part Pleiadian, as it turns out. That's the reason you can't tell them the blood types are the same, basically. The behaviors are the same. I'll give you one really brief story that illustrates this. Apparently, we are in an alliance now with the Pleiadians. And the story goes, there were two women, females from the Pleiades, who look just like us. And not only do they look like us, they behave like us. They're stuck out at Site 51, these two women. And they're bored, and they don't like being confined in this area out in the middle of a desert surrounded by barbed wire. And every night they can see the dome of light, which is Las Vegas, in the distance. So they started pestering their human hosts that they wanted to go to Vegas for the day. And the human hosts finally just said, okay, we'll get you some outfits. They got them human girl outfits. They could walk around on the streets in Vegas. No one would notice them, at least not immediately. And they went and took in some shows and played the slot machines for a day, and then were escorted back to Site 51, and they were happy. Now, knowing the male part of the species, the human males they sent to Site 51 to work on helping us perfect our anti-gravity and stuff, they would be all business. They wouldn't care about Vegas. But the two women, they wanted to go to Vegas. They wanted to see what the Earth girls were wearing close up. And so anyway, it's an amusing story, and it's just crazy enough to be true. If we're dealing with people who are not only similar to us in genetically and have red blood just like us, but also are psychologically similar to us, then this is entirely believable that this would happen.
Now, in your book, you give a situation estimate of the Earth And
Yes.
you describe the Earth as being kind of like in a neutral zone between
Yes.
three competing genotype groups or factions. On the one
Yes.
hand, there are the Greys. On the other hand, there are the Draco reptilians. You haven't talked
Yes.
too much
Yes,
about the
they are.
Draco reptilians, so maybe you can. This is your opportunity to just elaborate a little bit on that. And on the other hand, there are the Pleiadians, and these are the three major groups
Yes.
that are kind of vying for our attention and trying to kind of play a role in the future of our civilization. So yeah, you want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, and the universe is a complicated place, just like the Earth. But, basically, there are three different groups out there. This is a very basic understanding. There's a genotype out there that is basically just human. And it's both fascinating and baffling that they can have children with us, then the children are quite healthy. In fact, we are basically part of our genetic makeup is extraterrestrial because of past contact in ancient times. Okay, then there, of course, our little friends, the Greys. They have blue blood, which is one reason their colonization effort has failed, apparently. It is a failure. So that's good. That's good news. Their bad news is our good news. The Pleiadians have arrived. We're apparently in an alliance with them. They're urging us not to blow each other up and save the Greys a lot of trouble, because the Greys still want to take over this planet by hook or crook. And then, of course, there's the reptilians. Now, I talk with a lot of military people. The reports of reptilians we get, basically, there are very few reports. There's no reports of recovery of reptilian bodies from crashed spacecraft or anything like that. The accounts that I have heard were basically from the war in Vietnam, where they would encounter them in the jungle, especially near the demilitarized zone, which has a lot of deep cave system. And these people are basically what you would expect if dinosaurs on Earth had evolved into intelligent creatures. Now, here's another thing about the reptilians. If you are a military person out in the jungle and you're point, as they say, on the patrol, and you encounter a Pleiadian in the woods, you'll tell him, don't move, drop your guns, please come out where we can see you, and who are you and what are you doing here? And let's talk. Okay. Especially if you're in Vietnam and the person apparently has blonde hair and blue eyes, you probably think they're Russian, in fact. But here's the thing. So if you spot a gray in the woods, you would probably hesitate to you would probably yell at it and say, please don't move. And who are you and what are you doing here? The Greys do not look terribly threatening in a person-to-person contact. They certainly look strange, but they don't look terribly threatening. If you encounter an 8-foot tall reptilian with a mouthful of sharp teeth, you'll open fire immediately. And that is one thing that accounts for apparently the reptilians have not made much of a presence here like the Greys at all. They're not our friends. They have red blood, by the way, just like ours. They are well suited to live on a planet like ours. Just look at the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were very successful on Earth. It took a strange event from outer space, a big asteroid hitting the Earth, to destroy them and make way for us, basically, to evolve intelligence. So the reports, one of the problems I have with the reptilian aliens is they apparently are very bashful. They're much more careful than the Greys. They excite immediate fear and hostility on sight from human beings, especially if they are armed human beings. So as a result, you just don't, the reports on them are very few and far between. And even the reports that you get of them are, look very unreliable. There's a whole, a fellow named Ike has talked about alien shapeshifters. And, my response to that is, how come none of them gets run over by a car while jaywalking? And he would immediately turn into a giant lizard once he was dead because he could no longer shapeshift. I as a scientist, by the way, reptilians are well known to be able, the chameleon is a reptilian. You don't find that gift in any mammals. But in reptilians, you actually find the ability to blend in with the surroundings by changing your skin texture and everything like that. Octopi do that too. But especially among reptilians on Earth, this is a very common property. I lived in Florida, and we had these little chameleons living around there. And they would, if they were sitting on a green leaf, they would turn green. If they were sitting on your rug, they would turn orange. And and they were very clever. And so, but I think that's the origin of the shapes. But giving them almost supernatural abilities to, like, pose as the king and queen of England. This is, I find this very difficult to take seriously as a scientist. We had a very colorful character in American history named Jerry Rubin. He was head of the Weatherman faction of the Students for Democratic Society. If there was anything you could describe as a shapeshifter, it was him. He was a firebrand revolutionary when he was in his college days. Showed up for a congressional hearing carrying a toy M16 and love beads at the same time. He coined the phrase, "Don't trust anyone over 30." He also said, "Kill your parents." This guy was just a walking sloganeer, bravado, burn the country down character. He then retired from that and became a stockbroker on Wall Street and became a millionaire. He was a good, fast talker. He completely transformed himself like a chameleon, like a human chameleon, from being a college radical to being a confirmed to the core capitalist. He died one day. Yeah, he died one day in Hollywood because he stepped out in front of a car. He was jaywalking, which was very typical of him. He didn't believe in crosswalks or anything like that. He steps out in front of a car and got run over and killed. But he did not turn into a reptile after he was dead. A crowd sat there and watched him while they were waiting for the ambulance, watched him die. And the ambulance came and took him away. But he didn't turn into he died right there on the street. He didn't turn into a reptile. So I think that there are reptilians. I believe they have ability to have a chameleon type ability to just like in the movie Predator, that Predator character was a chameleon. He could blend in with the surroundings. I believe there are reptilian aliens like that. That's a trait we find in earthly reptiles. These guys from outer space. And, oh, by the way, they're the sworn enemies of the Pleiadians, apparently. All this stuff about St. George and the Dragon. The Pleiadians apparently had a war with the Draconians, and they lost the initial phases of that war, and they evacuated their entire planet, probably with massive loss of life. And we had a Battlestar Galactica-like convoy of ships taking what was left of the Pleiadians to another star system. Turns out they started out in a place called Lyra, the Harp, which is right next to the constellation Draco. And they then journeyed along the plane of the galaxy to the Pleiades, and they established themselves in the Pleiades, recovered, and became very powerful in the Pleiades. And they're one of the main, yeah, I'm sorry.
To my last question, and just so that we can kind of wrap it up soon, and
Sure.
that is at the end of the first Trump administration, there was this Israeli space scientist, Professor Haim Eshed, and he said that the
Yes.
Trump administration was working with the Galactic Federation. So do you know anything about that? And do you know if that contact has resumed with Trump coming in for a second administration?
I would imagine it would. The Galactic Federation was basically, if you want to know a depiction of that, watch the early Star Trek. You know, the early Star Trek was apparently loaded with information from the intelligence community. I mean, Spock was supposedly had copper-based blood. Of course, that's nonsense. He had red blood just like every other human on board. His mother was human. His father was a Vulcan. Instead of coming from the constellation Lyra, by the way, you know what he did? He played the lyre. The constellation Lyra means the harp. What does Spock play? The lyra. If you want to know an example of so the very humanoid aliens out there have formed a federation of enlightened peoples, and we are kind of being prepared to join that, apparently. So our future will look like Star Trek. It is my own belief, provided we don't do anything really stupid on this planet, like in Ukraine, in the next couple years, we're going to be fine. We're going to be fine, and our future will look like Star Trek. Japan was an example of a country that was very isolated, medieval, and it embarked on a program of sending its most educated people to Oxford and Harvard to learn the ways of the West. It imported a lot of foreign experts. Soon, Japan went from having ox carts to having steam trains, telegraphs. It became a thoroughly European level society, though still preserving many aspects of Japanese culture. But Japan showed how you transition from being a hermetically sealed society to suddenly embracing the larger world, which in our case is the larger cosmos. It can be done.
Well, I agree with you. I think we have a really bright future, that this human-looking group of extraterrestrials that are part of this Galactic Federation of Worlds, that they are here, and they are working with the Trump administration and to bring in this Star Trek future. So where do people go to buy your books or learn more about?
You can get. I'm sorry. Yes, Cosmic Awakening is available in both electronic form and in printed form on Amazon.com.
And if people want to get in touch with you, do you have a website or anything like that?
I haven't set up a website. I'm on X as at PhD Brandenburg. So if you want to become my follower, and I can follow you back, as they turn. I didn't know what even that term meant until a month ago. If we follow each other, we can communicate on the private message service at X, which has been a marvelous forum. So especially as the holidays close in, let us be grateful. Thanksgiving Day is approaching. Look, I got 3 children. I got 2 grandchildren. I got 2 beautiful granddaughters. And I want their future to be bright. And it will be. I believe it will be. We just have to soldier on through. I liken what we're going through now as being born. We're going down the birth canal. It's traumatic, yes. But it's the way of life. And once we emerge from the womb, we can grow and embrace the larger world. Just like Japan embraced the larger world and became a very modern power. Now, they made some other mistakes, but look at Japan now. So,
well, I want to thank you, Dr. Brandenburg, for being such an informative guest and sharing your scientific expertise and applying it to this very challenging topic of extraterrestrial life and UFOs. So I appreciate your insights.
Take the long view. This is about evolving human destiny. It's not just about some funny lights in the sky and things like that. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure and honor to be on your show, Michael.
Thank you. It's been an honor to have you.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.